Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Hi, Lisa.
Hello. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. It's good to see you 2 days in a row.
I know. we'll
So
be
for
we'll be
those
fed up of each other soon.
soon, right? A month of this. It's going to be fun.
You'd be sick of my face.
Oh, I don't think so. I think I'm going to be much wealthier in knowledge and experience by the end of this month, and I'm looking forward to it.
Fab.
I
That's
already
what I
have
like to hear.
so many, like, I've just finished actually going through our recording from last night this morning, and I already have like 20 questions about my own dogs and some of my patients, and I'm excited to find those answers as we go through the series.
Perfect. That's what we want.
That's what we want. So, guys, thank you for joining us live. Let us know where you're from and where you're joining us from and what your interest is. And if you have any questions, shout. That's what we're here for. That's why we're on Facebook, so that you can chat with us and interact with us. I'm really glad to have Lisa Hannaby from Nourish with me this morning. And we're going to be chatting a little bit about nutrition and a little bit about the series that we're running this month. So, Lisa, if you want to introduce yourself briefly, and then I will chat a little bit more about the series and ask you more about it as well.
Yeah, no problem. So, hi, I'm Lisa from Nourish. Some of you may follow me on social media already, but my interest really is nutritional psychology. So combining nutrition and sort of behaviour, and that's sort of the approach that I come from a human point of view. So I've worked with humans for a number of years, and from a psychological point of view, I could never understand why we didn't really look at nutritional assessment. It just didn't really make sense to me. So that's how I got interested in nutrition. And that's when it all kind of really made sense. I was like, this is huge. You know, why aren't we talking about this? So yeah, I came from the human arena into the pet world, and noticed that, you know, a lot of pets were facing similar health issues to humans. And that's sort of where I sort of started, really. So yeah, my passion is education. And I think the thing with nutrition, I mean, it's bad enough in the human arena. You know, if you're interested in health, you're always getting emails about try this diet, try that diet, do this, do that. You know, eggs are good for you, eggs are bad for you. We don't really know where we're coming from, you know, which way to go. And I don't think that's any different in the canine world. And for me, that's what I want to do. So I'm really passionate about education and getting the right information out there. I'm massively data driven and research driven. You know, I literally spend hours on end in the research databases, just kind of getting that information, because there is so much misinformation out there. So really, really thankful for this series opportunity and getting that information and just sharing it with practitioners, because I think with nutrition, you know, we obviously have nutritional practitioners, but, you know, anybody that works with animals, nutrition will play a role. So it's not necessarily having to be a specialist in that subject, but it's just actively acknowledging it plays a role. And, you know, you might want to refer on to somebody else, but it's just identifying that in the first place as well.
Absolutely. So for those of you that have just joined us, welcome. It's really great to have you. Lisa Hannaby from Nourish is joining us, and she's sharing a little bit about nutrition today, as well as about the series that we're running this month, which is all about nutrition, and specifically for us as veterinary rehabilitation therapists, how we're going to apply that, in our practices and why it's important to us. And I think that I mean, that's what it comes down to, right? Is why is this important to us? Because we are not specializing in nutrition. It's really not what we are focusing on and what we're doing. And for myself, I can only really speak for myself, but nutrition is quite overwhelming. You know, in last night's webinar, you highlighted how important the digestive system is. And just that on its own already is complicated, understanding how it works, where different nutrients are absorbed. And there are obviously differences between dogs and cats and horses. So understanding all the digestive systems and all the different ways that it's absorbed, and then going into the actual nutrition, what you're putting in the bowl, right? It just gets so complicated so quickly in my mind. So I shy away. I don't, right? So why is it important for us, Lisa, as veterinary physiotherapists or rehabilitation therapists? Why is it important for us to have a good understanding of nutrition and how it affects our patients?
I think, you know, it's this recovery journey, isn't it? And we always talk about that recovery process. And, you know, all animals are different, as you say, depending on which animals you're working with. You know, from my point of view, you know, the canine and feline digestive system is kind of where my interest is and what I know about. You know, give me a horse, I actually wouldn't have a clue where to start. I really wouldn't, because it's a totally different digestive system. And again, you know, that highlights that point, doesn't it? But if we're talking about this recovery process and we're really trying to support these patients, you know, we might be doing everything right in terms of a rehabilitation approach, but actually we're still not hitting the mark. And I suppose it can be quite frustrating thinking, well, how, you know, what's going wrong here, and why is that not improving as much as it potentially could be? So from my point of view, it's thinking, okay, well, actually, you've got the rehab stuff, great, but, you know, is there something there? And ultimately, if we're talking about recovery and injury rehabilitation, we're asking the body to do a job. And to do that job, it needs nutrients, it needs cofactors, it needs sort of the bricks and mortar to do that job. And where does the body get that from? It's largely from the diet. Although certain nutrients and, you know, compounds can be synthesized in the body, it's largely from the diet. So, you know, we can be thinking about, okay, well, actually what we're offering, is that going to give the body what it needs to recover?
Yeah, and one of the important things that you said last night was that you are not what you eat, but what you digest and absorb, or how does that one go?
Yeah,
So
absorbing use, absolutely.
yeah.
And this, you know, and I suppose that's the difficulty, because, you know, from a pet owner's point of view, you know, I've got my own dogs, and, you know, I want to think that I'm giving them everything that they need. You know, I create these bowls that in my eyes, they've got everything they need. But actually, if there's something going on in their digestive system, then just because I've put, you know, a perfect meal together doesn't mean actually that they're going to absorb, utilize and use those, you know, nutrients in the bowl. So this is where, you know, and the session that we do about stress is particularly important, because, you know, we can think about that in both the competitive dog or the injured dog. You know, if they've experienced a trauma, they've gone through, you know, really long rehab processes, they might have spent a significant amount of time in, you know, in a separate accommodation. So stress is a massive factor when we look at digestive health. So this is something to consider, you know, so we're not even talking about, you know, physically what might be wrong with the digestive system. So if there's inflammation or there's disease in any of the organs, it could be around stress and you know, that redirection of resources. So the body's thinking, well, hang on, I can digest food later, because actually I need to deal with what's facing me right at this moment. So, you know, it's about acknowledging that stress process in the body and how we can modulate that, and noticing it as practitioners. Okay, well, that might be impacting how well this dog is utilizing the nutrients, and how can we kind of help that process.
Okay, so that's going to be in next week's lecture, where you're really going to focus on stress, but you keep coming back to it. You know, in the first lecture as well, you're like stress. And now again, you're talking about stress. So I'm assuming that we're going to have a lot to learn next week. So guys, if you're joining us, welcome. It's really great to have you. If you have any questions for Lisa, please share them. We'd love to discuss any particular questions that you have. If you've watched last night's webinar, if you've watched the recording and you have any questions, feel free to ask them. Otherwise, email us at info@onlinepet.health with those questions, and we will respond via email, or we'll ask them in next week's live webinar. So I want to get a bit of an overview from you of what we can expect from this series. So for those of you that don't know, we are running a 4-part series right now. That means we have one live webinar each week for 4 weeks. Our first one was last night, and it was incredible. So really exciting. It's available as a recording. So if you missed it live, you can go and watch it as a recording. If you're not an Online Pet Health member, you can purchase a ticket and you'll get access to that recording and all 3 lives that are coming up. And you can purchase that ticket up until the last live airs. That's when the tickets close and you'll no longer be able to purchase one. So, but just a tip, the membership is much cheaper than buying a ticket for 4 webinars. So just join the membership for a month if you want to do that. And then, okay, so let's jump into each each of the lectures. So last night's webinar was on kind of general nutrition. Tell us a little bit about what we covered. And then we had a few questions that I'm going to ask you again. And I have some of my own that I would like a little bit more clarity on that I'm going to ask you as well. So what was last night's webinar about, and what can people expect if they watch it?
So last night's webinar was a whistle-stop tour. So it was quite speedy, but it was the overview of nutrition really as an umbrella term. And the reason it was very content heavy. And there is a lot there, but I do put a lot of information on the slide so that people can revisit, and obviously the recording is available, and that's generally because I want to get information out there, and ultimately I don't think you can consider nutrition without having that overarching understanding. So going through the digestive system, ultimately what affects the digestive system and how that can subsequently affect absorption, utilization of nutrients. And then we looked at specific macronutrients. So we looked at the role of carbohydrates, protein and fat in the diet of the dog. And then also we touched upon micronutrients as well. So we've got the macronutrients, which are needed in larger quantities in the body. And, we touched on the controversial idea of dogs needing carbohydrates in their diet. So if you're interested in that, then you can watch the recording. But also looking at micronutrients. So whilst they're needed in smaller amounts in the body, they are still necessary. So vitamins and minerals. And the key take home with vitamins and minerals is actually that they function as cofactors. So they assist processes in the body. And we often sort of forget about that role with micronutrients, but they are necessary for so many processes. And if we're thinking about rehabilitation, we're asking the body to do a job, then actually these processes need to occur, and we need these micronutrients to support that process. So that was sort of an overview of last night. It is very content heavy, but again, it is just that sort of overarching information to sort of move forward. So the sessions moving forward, we have got specific topics, so it's less information and more sort of application to practice, shall we say.
Okay, I have to say from last night's webinar, like I've said just now, for me, kind of understanding the digestive system and those nutrients becomes really overwhelming. And maybe it's just that, I've been repeating this over and over the last few years to try and understand, because I am interested. It is really important. But it made so much sense last night. And it was simple and straightforward and understandable, as opposed to complicated and overwhelming. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
So, there were a few really interesting points that came across in our questions, and that I think are really important to us as vet rehabbers, and I'd love to discuss that more. So the first one would be the link between vitamin D deficiency and obesity.
Yes.
And we see a lot of overweight dogs, we see a lot of obesity. So what is that link, and what do we need to know about it to help us treat obesity more effectively?
And this is, to date, we often see, vitamin D is a fat soluble vitamin. So the idea is actually that, if we've got adipose tissue, that potentially it could be stored in higher amounts, so there wouldn't actually be a deficiency. But this is the opposite is actually true. So in states of obesity, we regularly see vitamin D deficiency. And this is a concern just, generally, because we do see vitamin D deficiency in dogs as a whole. And that is largely through the food that they're eating. So, the type of food that they're eating, as much as we see on labels that it might be a balanced and complete diet, that actually we are still seeing this vitamin D deficiency. And this can be because, again, we're going back to that digestive system. So we've got poor absorption, poor utilization of that nutrient in the body. But regularly we see low vitamin D in obese clients, and the mechanism isn't entirely they haven't come to a consensus. And that is the great thing with research and science, isn't it? Somebody comes up with this idea and then someone says, well, actually, I think it's this and I think it's that. And there are some great theories, and we have got this idea of the chicken and egg scenario. So potentially, does obesity result in vitamin D deficiency, or does vitamin D deficiency contribute to the prevalence of obesity? And obesity, I think it's probably one of the key areas for you as vet rehabbers, because we do see large amounts of dogs that are obese, and we see how that affects rehab and and recovery. So it's something to consider. We aren't entirely sure of the mechanism, if I'm honest, but we do see that it occurs. So if there is a dog that is obese, the chances are they may have a vitamin D deficiency, and you can actually test for this. You can go to the vets and you can request a vitamin D test. So it's easy to establish, because the concern with vitamin D, it is a fat soluble vitamin, so you do have a risk of toxicity because it can be stored. So you don't want to be blindly supplementing. So you can establish those levels, but it is something to consider. And that's largely because, you know, vitamin D has such a wide ranging impact in the body. You know, it contributes to immune function. So if we actually want this sort of healthy recovery response, then we do need to make sure that vitamin D levels are appropriate. And you know, obesity it's complex. It's not quite as simple as that calorie in, calorie out, is it? You know, we can reduce portion size and we can still end up with a dog that isn't actually losing any weight. And this is where it does become a challenge. So you know, we've got two complex sort of ideas that then merge together, and we're still kind of stuck thinking, well, hang on, how does this all interact? But that's what I love about nutrition, because, you know, it's, as you say, it can be overwhelming, it can be complex, but the bottom line is we know this exists. We might not know how it exists yet. We're still kind of getting there. But actually, when we know it exists and we know it happens, then that's when we can deal with it. And we can, you know, the take home is that we don't want obese dogs, but we know that anyway.
Okay, nice. All right, then the next question was about the omega-3 and omega-6 ratio.
Yes.
And this is something that we know that we need to get our omega-3 and 6 right. We know that they're important for inflammation, for, you know, one is stimulating inflammation, one is down regulating inflammation. So tell us a little bit more about that and what the correct ratio is.
So the omega-6 to 3 ratio is 4:1 in the dog. And this is, I mean, I think this is one thing that I did talk about last night. You know, we often talk about omega-6 as being the bad omega, because, as you say, it can be thought of as pro-inflammatory. But the issue isn't necessarily that, you know, we've got a good one and a bad one. It's actually just about that ratio. And I think in some, you know, some commercial foods, the ratio can be up to 20 to 1. So 20, you know, omega-6 to 1 omega-3. And this is where the problem arises. We need omega-6, like I talked about last night. You know, omega-6 is really important for skin health. So it's not about getting rid of omega-6, it's about modulating that balance. And ultimately, we know that, you know, omega-3 is anti-inflammatory because of that action with COX enzymes. So it's not about getting rid of omega-6, it's just about increasing that omega-3 intake in relation to, ultimately, if you're feeding a dog with massive amounts of omega-6, then it's important to reduce that down. But, you know, this is why I'm a huge advocate for fresh feeding, because actually when you've got food in its whole food source, then it tends to have a more balanced ratio anyway. So yeah, it's a 4:1 ratio. And you know, when we think about some foods being 20:1, that kind of gives us an indication of the difference, you know, and what levels are actually prevalent in our dogs.
Okay, nice. So Michelle's joined us live. It's great to have you, Mish.
Hello.
And she says that this is her favorite area, dealing with obese patients and their nutrition and helping them back to a healthier life. I think that's really great, Mish. Thanks for sharing.
And this is what's really concerning, you know, because obesity as an issue, you know, when you look at the data, you know, I don't think it's particularly accurate. But when you talk to practitioners, they'd say probably 80% of their clients are probably obese. You know, it's a huge amount. And I think there's a cultural element. You know, are we used to seeing obese pets, so we don't necessarily see that they're actually obese? But yeah, you know, we see these wide ranging impacts, and of course, nutrition can play a role. So yeah, it's a hugely complex subject, but fascinating.
Love it. And then the other thing you just touched on last night, which I'm very interested in having more information about, is sarcopenia.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit more about the role that your nutrition plays in sarcopenia.
Well, I could talk about it, but I do actually talk about it in the final session.
Oh, okay.
So
Well then,
do you want to wait for the final session?
yes, I
A
want to
bit
wait
of a
for the final
tidbit.
session.
I talk about it particularly in relation to the gut muscle axis. So actually, if we think about the gut as sort of a roundabout, so I know you're not in the UK. Do you have roundabouts in South Africa?
I don't know what a roundabout is.
You probably don't then. So it's a road junction, and basically we have lots of roads that converge onto this roundabout, so you can sort of choose which way you go off the roundabout, if that makes sense.
Okay.
So the gut, we can kind of think about like a roundabout, and it has lots of roads sort of popping off it, and we know these as axes. So we've got the gut brain axis, we've got the gut skin axis, we've got the gut kidney axis, you know, and we've got the gut muscle axis. And what this is basically about is that we have this community of microbes in our gut which can influence muscle function, growth, structure, which I just find fascinating. And we found this out because we always test on germ-free mice, poor little things. You'd think we'd have moved on from this, wouldn't you, really? So we looked at germ-free mice, and we found that when they didn't have a microbial community in the gut, that actually they developed sarcopenia and massive muscle loss, reduced strength and function. And then when we did fecal transplants with normally raised mice, we actually found that they had increased strength and increased growth in their muscle, and they regained all of that muscle mass. So it's looking particularly at the role of the gut in muscle function, but then also we do look at the nutrition around muscle growth and muscle loss and atrophy, but that's in the last session.
I think that, I mean, that's so interesting. And we had a recent webinar with Margot Roman where she spoke about the microbiome, and it is just, I mean, it's a little bit mind blowing to think about it if it's not something you've thought about or heard about or learned about before. So I look forward to that last lecture and learning more about that. And if you can literally just change the diet or change the gut flora to deal with sarcopenia, that's
it's incredible, isn't it?
That's really helpful.
It is incredible. And yeah, I mean, it's a very new area. And to be honest, I wrote an article on it last week, and a lot of the data was sort of 2020, 21, and 2022. So it's very, very new. And obviously we sort of, you know, straight away people are like, well, probiotics obviously is the solution to this problem. But I kind of come a step back and think, actually, before we get to that, what can we do to support this gut flora?
Okay, nice. So Mish has corrected me. They're called traffic circles. We do have them here in South Africa. They just haven't been there.
There we go. I've learned something new. Traffic circles. There we go. So the gut is a traffic circle.
No, the gut is a traffic circle. And then she said that there's a huge impact on the owners too when you're working with a dog with obesity. She's had a patient and owner lose 20% body fat while the dog was on the weight clinic. So that's really cool.
That's amazing.
And Iftikhar, welcome. It's great to have you. Thanks for joining us. Okay, so let's jump to the next webinar in our series. You're going to be talking about the stressed or competitive dog.
Yes. So as you've probably gathered, stress is probably I love talking about stress because it permeates sort of every part of ours and our dog's life. And so yeah, I'm hugely passionate about stress and the impact that it has on the body. So in that particular webinar, I'll look at the biology of the stress response. So we'll sort of go through what actually happens during that stress response to give sort of a basic understanding of then how stress can influence digestive function. And ultimately, we'll also look at the other side of this scale, so how stress actually depletes certain nutrients in both. I mean, it applies to humans. So if you're a particularly stressed individual, you might find it interesting for yourself, but equally, you know, the same occurs in our dog as well. So we'll look at nutrition to support the stress response and recovery from the stress response. And then also, I mean, stress and competitiveness can go hand in hand because we quite often see in competitive dogs that they can get quite stressed. So that's sort of a given. But also I will be looking at nutrition for competitive dogs as well. So we'll be looking at nutrient needs and sort of, you know, how to best fuel a competitive dog as well.
Okay. That's going to be really awesome and I think really relevant to so many of us. So Michael, I'm glad that you've joined us. Welcome. He says in Boston, it's called a rotary.
I'm learning loads today. Who would have thought there'd be so many different names for one thing on a road?
So guys, what is it called where you're from? What is that circle with different exits on the road? Let us know.
We started with nutrition and now we're on traffic.
Traffic, right? Brilliant. Okay. All right. So guys, that's next week. Mish says, can diet support hormonal health or something like Fishing's disease, which is Cushing's disease? Yeah. So can diet support hormonal health or Cushing's?
Yes, I was going to say I've not heard of Fishing's disease. That's new. Please tell me what that is. Yes, it can. Not surprisingly, because actually nutrition, the thing is, when we talk about nutrition being implicated in health, then it's ultimately implicated in disease. So pretty much any disease state that you find the body in, nutrition can support in one way or another. But the interesting thing with dogs especially, and this is where some of the data, obviously we're so far ahead in human research, so we apply a lot of that data to dogs. The issue we've got with dogs is a lot of them are neutered, so we've removed those sort of hormones, haven't we? So if we think about the interplay between all of the different hormones, when we remove those hormones, then that then has an impact. So a lot of the data, we can sort of think, okay, well, it might apply, but equally we've got the other considerations. So we do look at menopausal data, so obviously women who have reduced hormones and how that sort of plays a role. But that is actually a really interesting area of how we can use nutrition to support in hormonal diseases. And I suppose the Cushing's element, it comes in because we're looking at adrenal function. So a lot of the stress stuff that we talk about next week will actually be quite relevant, because I do talk about that mechanism and adrenal function.
Okay, fantastic. So Michael has shared a little bit more information here with us. He says it looks like Big Ben, Parliament, Chevy Chase, or Clark Griswold. Okay, now you're speaking a whole nother language, Michael. Yeah. All right, so let's move on. So what can we expect from our second webinar, where we're going to be, oh no, wait, we've done that. You have answered that. The third webinar,
immunity,
healing and immunity. Yes.
I was trying to think, which one haven't we talked about? Yes, immunity and healing. And I suppose, well, they're all relevant for rehabbers, but I suppose more so with this one. So in terms of immunity, you're not surprised I'll be talking about the different nutrients that are, involved in the immune response. So how, the different roles that they have, and ultimately how we can include those nutrients in the diet. But you can't really talk about healing without inflammation. So we'll be talking about inflammation in quite a bit of detail, really, and looking at that response, but ultimately how we can support that response through nutrition. And it's this idea, we always think that inflammation is bad, isn't it? But you as rehabbers know that it's a necessary process for the body to go through that healing process. But the issue is, if we get too much inflammation, it becomes a problem. So I suppose the main take home with that session really is we're looking at immunity and inflammation as two of the same, really, but we're moving away from this idea of immune boosting, because ultimately we don't want to boost anything, we just want to support that function. And the same with inflammation, really, we need it because it's a necessary process, but we can look at inflammation in the body as a whole and how we can modulate that to support the recovery process. So that's the sort of the bare bones of that session, really. So it's about modulation, and I'll be tackling the immune boosting myth, shall we say.
Oh, I love that. Okay, I really love that. I'm excited because, yeah, like you say, we're understanding more and more that inflammation isn't bad, it's necessary. It's just about how we can support it to be as efficient and quick and moderate as we can. Because it has a job to do, it has a function, there's a reason for it. So
absolutely,
I'm excited. Fab. And then our last webinar is about feeding the microbiome. So I'm interested in that choice of word, feeding the microbiome. Tell us a little bit more about that webinar and what we can expect.
So when we talk about the microbiome, we always talk about the gut, just because that's sort of where the attention is. But I'm going to look at actually the range of microbiomes that we find in the canine body, and the one of particular interest is the skin microbiome, and that might be relevant to you guys, because if we're looking at any behaviors, we know that dogs will sort of lick or nibble at areas where they feel pain. but sometimes this can be misconstrued as a skin issue. So this is why I thought the skin microbiome was particularly relevant, because actually we can look at skin health and supporting skin health, and ultimately the role that the microbiome plays in that. But then that feeds, because we do have, if we're coming back to our roundabouts or our rotaries or traffic, what was yours called? Traffic stops. Traffic circles. We do have a gut skin axis as well. So it's actually looking at the role between that as well. And ultimately we come down to the microbiome in the gut. So how I'll sort of go through a bit of a journey really. So how the microbiome is actually formed, and then looking at things that can skew that microbiome really, because we know that when we have dysbiosis in the gut, we have a range of health issues. And as we can see, you know, we've got these axes going off in every direction in the body. If we make sure that the gut is healthy, then we've got half a chance with everything else that's going on really. So yeah, we'll be looking at what can skew the microbiome, so what can cause it to start having problems, and then ultimately how we can feed it. So the food that we feed and how we support that formation and ultimately support its health moving forwards. So we're talking about prebiotics, probiotics, postbiotics, all of the fancy buzzwords that people are like, I have no idea what to do because I don't know what they are.
All right, so I have one question that's based on your title here. Can you correct an imbalance in the microbiome through feeding? So, or do you need to literally introduce a new microbiome before you can kind of restore balance? So through a fecal transplant or biotics?
Data is suggesting that actually diet is one of the most consistent ways to modify the microbiome, and it's sustainable. And this is the point, you know, when we introduce certain bacteria, sometimes it can actually be quite short-lived and it's not necessarily sustainable. And this is why when you've got a course of probiotics, then, you know, you need to continue them for a period of time. Whereas when we're looking at dietary changes, they're actually sustainable because they're things that you can do every day. So, you know, if we look at sustainable lifestyle choices, then feeding the microbiome is probably one of the ways to do that. The issue we do have is that, you know, we do have early formation of the microbiome, which stays relatively stable. So we sometimes have to go through that process of starving out the bad bacteria and promoting the good bacteria. And this is where it can become problematic with things like fermented foods, because, you know, if we think about those, or we've got certain prebiotic foods which feeds those probiotics, then they're not necessarily fussy of which they feed, so they could feed potentially harmful bacteria. So it is about creating this balance. But this is why I really like food, because it's actually got a really safe margin. You know, you're not going to do that much damage with food, and it's sustainable. So we do see, you know, changes, and it can happen within sort of a 2-week period, which is actually quite quick. You know, we're not talking about months before you see improvements. So if we've got the diet right, and, you know, the other thing to consider, we don't yet know what the perfect microbiome is. We just don't. We don't know it in humans. We don't know it in dogs. So, you know, it's a bit of trial and error, really. What works for one dog probably won't work for another. And, you know, like us, really, some foods might really suit us, other foods might really not. So it is, you know, that individualized approach to nutrition, but it certainly you can feed the microbiome.
Whew, okay, that's very exciting. I like that, because that's the most attractive avenue, if you ask me.
Yeah.
All right,
100%.
Great. So guys, if you have any other questions, Mish, I see your question about prebiotics and that it's answered. I'm really glad. If you guys have any other questions, please pop them in. What I want to do quickly is we have been broadcasting most of our webinars as recordings. So for those of you that have forgotten how to join a live webinar as an online pet health member, I just want to do a very quick, give you a very quick reminder. So I'm going to pull up my screen so that you can see. Share screen. Let me figure this out quickly. Every app has a whole different way of doing it. So, okay, can you guys see my screen here?
I can, so I'm assuming everyone else can.
Okay, perfect. So when you log into your members portal as an online pet health member, you come to this page. So this series is running on the small animal membership. You hop in there. And this is really simple. We've tried to really make it as easy for you guys as we can. And here at the top of the page, you see upcoming webinar. And there's our next one, the role of nutrition in canine rehab patients, nutrition for stressed or competitive dogs. I do suggest that you add it to your calendar because it's a live event, so that you have a reminder and you just click that calendar and go through the process. And to join the live webinar, you click the button. It's going to take you to the webinar registration page. You fill in your name and your email address, you click register, and it takes you to the waiting room when it's time for the webinar. And from there we go live, and that's it, as simple as that. As a reminder, if it's a recorded webinar, there will be a button here that says that the webinar is now available in your members portal, and you can watch it from there. So I hope that simplifies it. If you have any trouble, feel free to just WhatsApp us. So you are, as members, you are part of a WhatsApp group that only we can send WhatsApps on, but our numbers are on there. So just pop us a WhatsApp through that, through that group, and we'll help you out if we need to. Or email Michelle. She's always ready to help as well. So I hope that helps, and I hope you guys are going to join us next week. Oh, and Michael, if you're still with us, I wanted to give you a shout out because I used a lot of your photos of all your meal prep for your beautiful dogs to advertise our series here, because I thought they were really appropriate and just great, very inspiring. I find them very inspiring for me to do better with my own dogs. So thank you for those, and I look forward to sharing them with everyone over the next few weeks and learning with you guys.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you, Lisa, and thank you to all of those that have joined us. And yes, again, if there are any questions, please send them through to us. You can email Michelle anytime at info@onlinepet.health, and we will see you guys live next week.
We will.
Bye.
Bye-bye.